Do you realize how easily your energy gets shaped by silent pressure? You think your limits are yours, yet someone keeps stretching them for you. If you want to stay untouched by quiet, draining control, listen carefully. First, understand that emotional pressure rarely enters through loud demands. It enters through subtle tension. It does not attack your logic directly. It slowly bends your comfort and attention. The more you adapt without noticing, the more your inner compass becomes weaker. You start adjusting your tone, your timing, even your silence to avoid discomfort. This is how manipulators train people without a single clear instruction or visible threat. Hidden controllers rely on one simple rule: shape feelings first, thoughts will follow later. They know that when your nervous system feels unsafe, your boundaries begin to melt. So they create conditions where you feel guilty for resting and guilty for refusing. You feel responsible for other people and irresponsible when you protect your own energy. That double bind keeps you stuck. Whatever you choose, you secretly feel that you failed. Machiavelli once said, if you want control, never attack the fortress directly. In psychological terms, the fortress is your self-respect, your sense of inner worth. Instead of attacking it openly, emotional manipulators work on the bridges around it. They weaken your confidence, your clarity, and your trust in your own perception. Once those bridges are unstable, you walk back to the manipulator for guidance yourself. Notice how emotional draining often starts with very small, repeated tests of your limits. You are pushed to be available a little longer, a little more frequently, without discussion. Your small no gets ignored, then questioned, then gently shamed as being oversensitive. Slowly, your nervous system learns that saying no brings tension, while saying yes brings relief. So you start saying yes to avoid discomfort, not because you truly agree inside. Albert Bandura once said, if behavior gets rewarded, it becomes a script inside you. Manipulators secretly reward the behavior that benefits them and punish what threatens their control. When you stay quiet while feeling uncomfortable, they respond with calmness, approval, or temporary peace. When you assert a boundary, they respond with coldness, distance, or subtle guilt-inducing remarks. Your body remembers this pattern faster than your conscious mind. It learns where safety seems. This becomes a training loop. You feel drained yet still move closer to the pressure. You cancel your own needs to maintain harmony because conflict feels heavier than self-abandonment. Your emotions become programmed to protect the relationship with pressure, not the relationship with yourself. You start thinking in questions like, what if they feel bad? What if I disappoint? By repeating these thoughts, you quietly place their comfort above your mental and emotional health. Silent manipulators also use comparison as a tool to deepen emotional pressure and exhaustion. They hint that others would tolerate more, give more, or stay available without complaining. You start doubting your natural need for rest, space, and emotional recovery from constant demands. Comparison rewrites your standards. Suddenly, basic self-care looks selfish, and overgiving looks normal. This is how you become proud of surviving pressure, instead of refusing unhealthy expectations completely. Another hidden mechanism is moral manipulation, where your values are used against your well-being. If you value kindness, they stretch your kindness until it becomes self-harm in disguise. If you value loyalty, they test how much disrespect you will tolerate before finally stepping back. If you value peace, they force you to choose peace outside while living with war inside. Your pure values slowly become chains, because they are tied to constant emotional exhaustion and guilt. The most dangerous part is that emotional pressure feels like your own choice after some time. You say, I decided to help, I chose to stay, I wanted to be kind. Underneath, each choice was trained by repeated fear of disapproval, distance, or silent punishment. So the draining system hides behind your identity, wearing the mask of your personal values. When you defend that mask, whose needs are you truly protecting, yours or the pressure? To outsmart this system, you must first separate your feelings from their reactions. Your guilt is not a reliable compass, while you stand inside trained emotional pressure. Instead of asking, are they upset? Start asking, is this behavior fair to my well-being? This small internal shift breaks the first layer of conditioning, the link between guilt and obedience. When guilt loses power, emotional manipulators lose their fastest shortcut into your decisions and daily choices. Next, you need to notice how your body reacts before your mind explains the situation. Tension in the chest, heaviness in the stomach, sudden tiredness, all signal emotional overloading. You are taught to ignore these signals, to perform and stay polite even while collapsing. By bringing attention back to these sensations, you reverse the training that kept you compliant. Your body becomes an early alarm, telling you that something is wrong before words appear. Manipulators fear your awareness more than your anger, because awareness cannot be easily redirected. Anger can be labeled dramatic or unstable, but awareness quietly withdraws free energy from control. When you start seeing patterns, their old tactics look predictable, repetitive, and strangely mechanical to you. Behaviors that once felt personal now look like scripts that could work on almost anyone. The moment you see a script, you are no longer fully inside its influence. This understanding does not immediately remove emotional pressure, but it changes who holds the remote. You stop asking what should I do for them, and start asking what protects my energy. You experiment with small boundaries, a shorter reply, a delayed response, a refusal without justification. Each small act sends a new message to your nervous system. Safety lives inside self-respect. Slowly, your inner world learns that peace does not depend on constantly absorbing outside tension. However, every draining system has a defense mechanism. It intensifies pressure when you start resisting. You may notice sudden emotional distance, sharper comments, or moral reminders about your previous generosity. This is a sign that you are touching the hidden core of their control. Your new boundaries are being tested, not because they are wrong, but because they are new. In that moment, will you return to the old trained script or hold your new line? Do you know why emotional pressure feels heavier when you finally resist? You think you are protecting yourself, yet something inside fears the silence that follows. If you want to reclaim your mind from draining influence, pay close attention. Emotional manipulators rely on emotional contrast, a cycle of tension and temporary relief. Your brain becomes conditioned to expect calm only after you bend your boundaries. This creates a prediction pattern. You sense pressure before it arrives, so you overgive early. Your decisions become defensive, not intentional, because you are avoiding a future discomfort. The draining effect grows stronger when you believe avoiding conflict is more important than protecting yourself. The mind begins linking your peace with someone else's satisfaction, and this is the core trap. If they are calm, you feel safe. If they are distant, you feel anxious. This connection is not natural. It is conditioned through repeated cycles of pressure and subtle reward. Over time, your nervous system is trained to keep the manipulator comfortable at any cost. You start reading their tone, mood, and silence more than your own emotional state. Machiavelli once said, if you control expectations, you control behavior. Expectations are redesigned silently. You start believing that your needs are less important. You feel obligated to stay available because they expect your quick response and full cooperation. The more you fulfill those expectations, the more demanding and draining the emotional system becomes. Soon you forget which desires are yours and which decisions were shaped by that pressure. Manipulators also use subtle confusion to weaken your perception of emotional imbalance. When you express discomfort, they respond with mild doubt, gentle questioning, or defensive reasoning. You hear sentences like "you are overthinking" or "you misunderstood the situation." Slowly your certainty fades. You start assuming you misjudge every uncomfortable feeling. Once doubt replaces clarity, your decisions start serving the draining system unconsciously. Albert Bandura once said, if you weaken self-belief, you weaken all resistance. Self-belief falls when your internal signals stop matching external responses. When you feel hurt but they call it normal, you start distrusting your own intuition. When you feel overwhelmed but they call it small, you minimize your own exhaustion. This mismatch creates cognitive dissonance, and you resolve it by adjusting to their version of reality. The draining system also relies on emotional momentum, pushing you faster than you can reflect. You are pressured to respond quickly, decide quickly, and stay available without pause. Your mind loses the space to think, so it defaults to automatic compliance. Any delay from your side brings discomfort, guilt, or suspicion from the manipulator. The faster you move, the less you notice the subtle ways control is shaping your behavior. One powerful tactic is selective silence, a form of passive pressure that drains energy quickly. When they stay quiet at strategic moments, your mind fills the gap with fear or responsibility. You assume you did something wrong and rush to fix a situation that was never your burden. You invest emotional labor into solving a silence that they created intentionally. Your anxiety works for them, and they maintain control without speaking a single word. Emotional draining also intensifies when you become addicted to small moments of approval. After long periods of tension, a small smile or warm tone feels like a reward. Your brain releases relief, and you mistake relief for connection. These tiny bits of approval keep you staying longer inside an unhealthy emotional system. You are not attached to the person. You are attached to the relief they give you after draining you. Another hidden method is moral weight, where your good intentions become psychological leverage. You feel obligated to stay kind, patient, and understanding no matter how much it costs you. You fear being labeled selfish even when you protect your well-being. Your desire to be morally good becomes a chain that keeps you inside emotional exhaustion. The manipulator controls you by using your own values as invisible ropes around your decisions. As draining patterns continue, your sense of identity becomes tied to endurance. You start believing that strength means tolerating more than others. You feel proud of surviving pressure instead of questioning why you must survive it at all. You confuse emotional numbness with emotional maturity, thinking silence means growth. This is how the draining cycle convinces you to protect the very system that is weakening you. The deeper trap begins when you adopt self-blame as a default response. You think maybe I should be more patient, or maybe I reacted too strongly. Self-blame keeps you from seeing how the entire emotional structure is designed to exhaust you. Your focus shifts from understanding the pressure to improving yourself endlessly. Manipulators prefer this because a self-correcting person requires no external force to control. To outsmart emotional draining, you must break the loop where your feelings depend on their reactions. Your emotional state needs to return to your internal compass, not their approval or silence. This begins with observing how often your mood changes based on someone else's behavior. If their tone shapes your confidence, your boundaries are already compromised. If their silence shapes your anxiety, your emotional independence is already fractured. Awareness creates distance, and distance interrupts manipulation. When you step back mentally, even for a moment, you see the draining cycle from above. Behaviors that once felt personal start looking like repeated strategies used on many people. You realize that emotional pressure is never a sign of your weakness. It is a sign of their dependence on control. Your self-respect becomes the point where their influence begins to fade. But remember, every draining system has a hidden shift when you pull back your energy. Their behavior becomes louder, colder, or more guilt-inducing because they feel the loss of control. This reaction is not proof that you are wrong. It is proof that your awareness is working. The question is, have you noticed the next layer of emotional pressure waiting beneath their response? Do you know why emotional pressure becomes sharper when you finally see the pattern? You think the cycle is ending, yet the manipulator begins a new invisible tactic. If you want to stay mentally untouched, observe what happens beneath the surface. Emotional draining evolves in layers, and each layer activates when the previous one stops working. The first layer uses guilt, the second uses confusion, and the third uses subtle dependence. Dependence is created when your sense of stability becomes tied to their approval or emotional tone. You stop asking what you need and start asking what will keep them calm. Your internal compass becomes external, pointing toward their reactions instead of your well-being. This shift is not accidental. It is manufactured through repeated emotional conditioning. When you sacrifice your time, they reward you with peace. When you set boundaries, they respond with tension. Your brain learns that self-respect equals conflict and self-neglect equals harmony. This conditioning makes you choose emotional survival over personal freedom. And once that script is installed, the draining cycle does not need constant effort to continue. Machiavelli once said, if you control fear and hope, you control the entire mind. Manipulators do this by alternating between warmth and withdrawal. Warmth keeps you hopeful, withdrawal keeps you fearful, and hope plus fear becomes a leash. You spend more time anticipating their mood than understanding your exhaustion. Every emotional high feels earned. Every emotional low feels like your personal failure. This is where psychological exhaustion deepens, because uncertainty drains more energy than conflict. You never know which version of the person will appear, so your mind stays alert. Alertness becomes your default state, and your nervous system enters long-term vigilance. You call it sensitivity, empathy, or patience, but it is actually emotional survival disguised as kindness. You adjust yourself constantly to prevent an emotional shift you cannot fully predict. Albert Bandura once said, if the environment changes behavior, then behavior shapes belief. Your environment becomes unpredictable, so your behavior becomes cautious and overly flexible. This cautious behavior, then, shapes your belief that you must remain careful to avoid emotional disruption. Your identity shifts subtly. You begin valuing peacekeeping more than personal balance. And when belief changes, the draining system no longer needs force. Your mind continues it automatically. Another quiet layer of manipulation is emotional inversion, where your natural responses get reversed. Your discomfort becomes an overreaction, your silence becomes disrespect, your boundaries become selfishness. Meanwhile, their pressure becomes concern, their distance becomes normal, their demands become justified. This inversion makes you defend the wrong behavior and question your correct instincts. Slowly, your emotional reality bends to match the manipulator's narrative. One of the strongest draining mechanisms is psychological debt, a feeling that you owe them something. They remind you of the times they were patient or helpful, even if those moments were minimal. You begin compensating for that imagined debt by giving more attention, energy, and emotional labor. Debt keeps you compliant because you fear appearing ungrateful or insensitive. You forget that real connection does not demand repayment in the currency of exhaustion. Emotional draining also grows stronger through micro-expectations, the small unspoken demands you try to meet. You reply quickly even when tired, you stay available even when busy, you adjust even when overwhelmed. Each micro-expectation takes a small piece of your emotional bandwidth. Individually, they look harmless, but collectively, they create chronic psychological fatigue. You start living in a performance mode, where your value depends on constant emotional output. Manipulators exploit another mental weakness, your desire to be understood. They listen only when it benefits control, not connection. Your explanations are taken as permission for them to continue draining you. You share more hoping they will finally see your perspective, but they use that information strategically. They learn what triggers you, what comforts you, and what keeps you emotionally compliant. Over time, you begin accepting exhaustion as a normal emotional state. You think that being tired is simply part of being responsible and supportive. You mistake overextension for loyalty and silence for emotional strength. Your threshold for discomfort rises, and you call it personal growth. But real growth is not about tolerating pressure. It is about recognizing where it comes from. The draining system becomes most powerful when you start abandoning your inner signals. Your intuition becomes faint because you learn to mistrust it. Your emotions become numb because you learn to suppress them. Your boundaries fade because you learn to avoid tension. You become a version of yourself that survives the pressure but does not belong to yourself anymore. To outsmart emotional draining, you must bring awareness back to your original intuition. Your first feeling is often the truth before manipulation reshapes it. When something feels heavy, you must ask why, not how to tolerate it better. When something feels unbalanced, you must ask what pattern is repeating. When something feels draining, you must ask whose energy you are protecting at your own expense. This awakening creates internal resistance even before external change. The draining system senses this shift because you stop responding automatically. Your emotional availability becomes selective, your compliance becomes slower, your reactions become thoughtful. That subtle change threatens the psychological balance the manipulator built. Which raises the next question. What happens when the draining system realizes you are no longer fully under its influence? Do you know why draining behavior becomes more strategic when you stop reacting on command? You think you are simply becoming aware, but awareness threatens the entire control system. If you want to stay mentally untouchable, you must understand the next hidden layer. When emotional pressure loses its automatic hold on you, manipulators activate the compensation phase. This phase begins when they sense your energy pulling back, even slightly. They often respond with sudden politeness, unusual warmth, or unexpected softness. This shift is not genuine emotional change, it is strategic recalibration. The goal is simple: rebuild the comfort you used to feel around them so you return to compliance. This tactic works because your mind remembers the early approval they once offered. Your brain feels relieved by the sudden calmness, and you confuse relief with connection. You think the pressure is ending, but the draining cycle is simply taking a new shape. The manipulator wants to restore your emotional dependence, not your emotional safety. Their sudden kindness is a psychological anchor designed to pull you back into old patterns. Machiavelli once said, if control weakens, show benevolence to regain influence. Strategic kindness becomes a tool that hides their earlier draining tactics. You interpret the change as growth or understanding, but it is a calculated shift. Your boundaries lower because you want to believe the pressure is gone. But pressure never disappears, it only adjusts to your new level of awareness. Another advanced technique is subtle self-victimization, where manipulators present themselves as misunderstood. They imply that your distance is hurting them, even if they never respected your emotional limits. You feel guilty again, believing you caused imbalance by trying to protect yourself. This guilt pulls you back into old emotional obligations, exactly where they want you to be. Your emotional strength becomes a responsibility you feel compelled to use for their comfort. Albert Bandura once said, if behavior is framed as harm, people respond with guilt. Manipulators use this principle by turning your boundary into an emotional injury. Your healthy distance is reframed as coldness, your clarity is reframed as overreaction. You begin apologizing for protecting your energy, a clear sign of conditioning. You start repairing emotional damage that you did not cause in the first place. When this layer loses power, manipulators switch to emotional unpredictability. They alternate between warmth and coldness in rapid cycles to destabilize your clarity. This prevents you from forming a stable emotional conclusion about the relationship. You start overthinking again, wondering whether you misjudged everything. Uncertainty becomes the new form of pressure, and uncertainty drains more energy than conflict. This unpredictability forces you to scan every interaction for hidden meaning. You try to decode tone, silence, and attention like encrypted psychological signals. Your focus shifts from healing to analyzing, from detachment to interpretation. This is exactly where manipulators regain control, inside your constant mental analysis. Your mind becomes busy, and a busy mind cannot maintain strong boundaries. Another tactic is emotional mirroring, where they reflect your improved behavior back at you. If you become calm, they become calmer. If you become distant, they become gentle. The goal is to blur the boundary between your progress and their adaptation. You lose track of who truly changed and who is just responding strategically. This confusion slows down your emotional independence and keeps you tied to their patterns. Manipulators also rely on psychological nostalgia, reminding you of past harmony. They subtly recall moments when things felt easier, lighter, or more peaceful. Nostalgia makes you question whether you were wrong to pull away. You forget the draining cycles and remember only the rare comfort. Your brain chooses the softer memory over the harsh reality, pulling you backward. The draining system becomes most fragile when you start choosing self-trust over external validation. Your intuition becomes sharper, your perception becomes clearer, your reactions become slower. You stop absorbing tension automatically and begin letting pressure fall without responding. This small internal shift is the first sign that emotional draining is losing its grip. The manipulator recognizes this shift faster than you realize because your silence no longer obeys. But awareness alone is not enough. You must recognize the emotional illusion that forms next. The draining system often creates a final trap, making you question the legitimacy of your awareness. You think maybe the pressure was never real, or maybe I misunderstood everything. This doubt appears not because you are wrong, but because the system is collapsing. The question now is simple yet powerful. What will happen when you stop believing the emotional illusions that once kept you drained? Do you know why self-doubt grows stronger right when you start breaking the pattern? You think the confusion is a sign of weakness, but it is actually a sign of awakening. If you want to dismantle emotional draining completely, watch how your mind gets tested next. The most powerful weapon manipulators use at this stage is internal distortion. They no longer need to pressure you directly. Your own thoughts begin doing the work for them. You question your perception, your boundaries, your emotional reactions, even your clarity. You think maybe I am exaggerating, or maybe I was too sensitive. This internal conflict drains more energy than any external behavior ever could. The draining system uses what psychologists call cognitive reconditioning. After long exposure to emotional inconsistency, your mind learns to mistrust its own alarms. You feel discomfort but immediately silence it, thinking you are overreacting. You feel tension but force yourself to stay calm to avoid guilt. Your intuition becomes faint because you trained yourself to ignore it for too long. Machiavelli once said, if you blur a person's judgment, they can be guided without resistance. Emotional manipulators blur your judgment by giving you half-truth and half-denial. You never receive full clarity, only fragments of reassurance mixed with subtle invalidation. This mixed messaging confuses your sense of right and wrong. Once moral clarity fades, manipulation becomes easier to maintain. Another draining tactic activated at this stage is emotional minimization. They downplay your discomfort, saying things like it was not that serious or you misunderstood again. You begin accepting their version of events as more logical than your emotional experience. Logic becomes their shield, emotion becomes your weakness. But a balanced mind requires both, and removing emotion weakens your self-protection. Albert Bandura once said, if a person doubts their ability, pressure can easily reshape them. Manipulators exploit self-doubt because a doubting mind becomes compliant without resistance. You start giving second chances not out of compassion, but out of insecurity. You assume the problem must be your perception rather than the pattern itself. Self-doubt becomes the quiet chain that pulls you back even when you consciously want to move forward. Another hidden mechanism is emotional mirroring reversal. Earlier, they copied your calmness to keep you unsure. Now they copy your concerns to appear aligned. If you express worry, they suddenly express the same worry in their own words. If you mention a boundary, they claim to respect those boundaries deeply. You mistake this mimicry for genuine understanding, even though it is a tactic to regain closeness. After this comes the emotional reset phase, which is the most deceptive part of the draining cycle. The manipulator behaves consistently kind for a short time, creating a false sense of safety. Your nervous system relaxes because the tension is gone. You begin thinking maybe they have finally changed, or maybe everything was misunderstanding. But this reset is temporary, carefully timed to lower your guard. When your guard drops, draining patterns slowly reappear but in softer, disguised forms. A subtle complaint here, a quiet expectation there, a small guilt trigger somewhere. You adjust again without realizing it because the pressure returns gradually, not suddenly. You start losing the clarity you fought to build. Your emotional independence begins to shrink, just enough for the draining system to continue. Psychologists call this intermittent control, the most energy-draining form of influence. You never get enough consistency to feel safe, and never enough distance to break free. Your mind stays in a suspended state between doubt and hope. This psychological tension drains more energy than actual conflict. You exist in a loop where you wait for stability that never fully arrives. To outsmart this, you must recognize the pattern hidden beneath temporary peace. Temporary calm does not erase the history of emotional exhaustion. A relaxed week does not cancel months of pressure. Strategic kindness does not equal real change. Awareness becomes your armor because you see beyond momentary emotional comfort. Your mind must learn to separate improvement from manipulation. Real improvement is consistent, steady, and does not require your exhaustion. Manipulative change is sudden, dramatic, and collapses the moment you stop overgiving. One nourishes your energy, the other drains it. Your body knows the difference long before your thoughts do. Emotional draining becomes weakest when you stop treating tension as your fault. Your perspective becomes stronger, your intuition becomes sharper, your boundaries become firmer. You stop abandoning yourself to maintain artificial harmony. You choose clarity over confusion, distance over chaos, truth over emotional illusion. And for the first time, the draining system loses its psychological leverage over your inner world. But even after all this awareness, a final trap remains, the one most people fall into unknowingly. When you outgrow emotional draining, what hidden test appears next to see whether you are truly free? Do you know why the final test appears only when you think you are completely free? You think the cycle has ended, yet something subtle pulls at your mind one last time. If you want to break emotional draining forever, understand this final psychological twist. The last stage of manipulation is not external pressure, it is internal residue. Even when the draining system loses power, your mind still carries the marks of old conditioning. You may feel sudden guilt for creating distance, even when the distance is healthy. You may feel responsible for someone's emotions, even when they trained you to feel that way. This residue is not loyalty, it is leftover psychological programming. The draining system depended on your emotional reflex more than your conscious decisions. Those reflexes do not disappear overnight. They activate when you feel tired, uncertain, or nostalgic. You may suddenly crave their approval, their warmth, or their presence. This craving is not connection, it is withdrawal from emotional dependency. Once you recognize it as withdrawal, its power starts fading instantly. Machiavelli once said, if influence remains in the memory, control continues in absence. The memory of pressure can become a shadow that lingers even after awareness. It tries to convince you that stepping away was too harsh or your boundaries too strict. This is the final illusion, making you question the freedom you have earned. The truth is that emotional draining is broken only when you stop negotiating with your own past. Albert Bandura once said, if self-belief returns, external pressure collapses. This final stage is about rebuilding self-belief, the one stolen from you piece by piece. You begin trusting your intuition again, because it warned you long before your mind saw the pattern. You start valuing your emotional limits again, because they protected you long before guilt weakened them. Your internal signals strengthen, and emotional pressure fails to shape your judgment anymore. The last trap manipulators rely on is emotional relapse. They may reappear with softness, calmness, or unexpected vulnerability. They may show sudden accountability or dramatic regret that was never present before. This becomes a psychological test, not of their sincerity, but of your growth. The question becomes simple: are you responding out of clarity or old conditioning? The draining cycle tries to reopen through the door you once kept unlocked. That door is your desire to fix things, understand deeply, or save someone emotionally. If you keep that door closed, the system ends completely. If you open it even slightly, the cycle restarts in a softer but equally draining form. Awareness at this stage must be firm, calm, and without emotional negotiation. Breaking free is not about anger, revenge, or rejection. It is about reclaiming the energy you once gave away unconsciously. You stop explaining your boundaries and simply follow them. You stop proving your worth and simply honor it. You stop seeking emotional peace from the same place that once drained it. Your mind begins changing quietly. You respond slower, think clearer, feel lighter. Your emotional space grows wider, your decisions become independent, your tone becomes stable. You no longer react to pressure, you observe it from distance. You no longer chase approval, you choose alignment. You no longer fear silence, you use it as clarity. Once this transformation begins, emotional draining cannot survive around you anymore. Manipulators lose interest because you no longer feed their psychological system. Your inner world becomes unshakable because it is built on self-trust, not external validation. Your emotions become calm because they no longer revolve around unpredictable reactions. You become the kind of person who cannot be quietly drained, controlled, or shaped by hidden influence. Your freedom does not end the draining system, it ends your role inside it. You realize the system was always dependent on your emotional participation. Without your energy, the cycle collapses, the tactics weaken, the influence disappears. You do not fight for power, you simply reclaim the power that always belonged to you. And that is the moment when the draining pattern ends not just in behavior, but in your identity. Now a deeper question rises, one that determines the rest of your emotional future. If you have finally stopped absorbing emotional pressure, what new version of yourself is about to emerge?